The devil in Texas doesn't always have horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes he wears a tailored suit and a silver-tongued smile. In the unforgiving heart of the West, a single moment of kindness can ripple through time, returning as a storm of justice when it's needed most. This is a story of a debt forged in the terror of a child's scream and the deadly hiss of a rattlesnake. It's the story of a forgotten ranch hand, Silas Kane, who found himself on the wrong side of a hangman's noose, with his only hope for salvation being the ghost of a little girl he once saved, a ghost who now carries a marshal's badge and a cult peacemaker. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Texas plains in the summer of '78. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the shimmering waves of heat rising from the grama grass, and on the weathered shoulders of Silas Kane. Silas was a man carved from the land itself, all leathered skin, sun-crinkled eyes, and a silence born of long days, with only the wind and the cattle for company. He was a ranch hand on the Circle the Five, owned by John Vance, a decent man with a kind heart and a 10-year-old daughter who was the apple of his eye. That daughter, Elara, or Ellie, as everyone called her, was a wisp of a thing, with hair the color of spun corn silk, and eyes the deep blue of a desert twilight. She trailed Silas like a loyal pup, her endless questions, a stark contrast to his stoic quiet. He'd show her how to read the clouds for rain, how to tell a coyote track from a dog's, and how to gently soothe a spooked mare. He never had a family of his own. The war and the years that followed had stripped that possibility from him. In Ellie, he found a fragile echo of what might have been. On this particular blazingly hot afternoon, Silas was mending a stretch of fence line near the dry creek bed, a place where the shadows of the cottonwoods offered a sliver of relief. Ellie sat on a large flat rock nearby, weaving a crown of wildflowers and chattering away about a story she'd read in a dime novel. And then, the hero Canyon Jack. He drew his pistol so fast it was just a blur. Sigh, a blur. And he shot the black hat's gun right out of his hand. "Could you do that? Are you as fast as Canyon Jack?" Silas grunted, twisting a length of wire tight with his pliers. "Dime novels are full of smoke, Ellie. A man pulls a gun. He's aiming to kill, not to play tricks. It's a messy business." "But it's heroic," she insisted. He paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a scarred hand. He looked at her at the fierce innocence in her eyes. "Heroism ain't about being fast, kid. It's about being there when you're needed. It's about doing what's right, even when your knees are shaking." As he spoke, a flicker of movement in the shade beneath her rock snagged his eye. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of pattern against the dusty earth. His blood ran cold. The wildflower she was reaching for, which had tumbled just off the edge of the rock, lay inches from the coiled, diamond-patterned body of a western diamondback. It was big-old and patient, its spade-shaped head perfectly still. Time seemed to warp and slow. Ellie's small hand, smudged with dirt, was inching closer. The fork of the snake's tongue tasted the air. Silas didn't have time to shout, no time to explain. Any sudden noise would trigger the strike. In one fluid, desperate motion, he dropped his pliers and launched himself forward. He covered the 10 feet between them in 2 massive strides, his mind screaming, his body acting on pure, primal instinct. He shoved her hard, sending her tumbling backward off the far side of the rock with a startled cry. In the same instant, he brought his heavy leather boot down with all his force, right behind the snake's head. The serpent, startled by his sudden charge, had begun its rattling buzz, a sound that cut through the afternoon stillness like a blade. It struck not at the girl, but at the man who had replaced her. An explosion of agony tore through Silas's calf. He felt the needle-sharp penetration of the fangs, a searing, white-hot fire that shot up his leg. He grit his teeth against a yell, stomping again and again, his vision blurring at the edges. The snake thrashed its body, a whip of pure muscle, until finally, with a sickening crunch of bone, it lay still. "Say!" Ellie shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her face pale with terror and confusion. "You pushed me. What?" Then she saw it. The dead snake and the dark twin puncture marks on Silas's leg, already beginning to swell and discolor. Panic seized her, but Silas, leaning heavily against the rock, his face ashen, focused on her with an intensity that cut through his own agony. "Ellie, go. Run to the house." He rasped, his voice tight. "Get your pa and bring my knife from my saddlebag, the big one. Go." For a second, she was frozen. Then his command broke the spell. She turned and ran, her little legs pumping faster than they ever had, before tears streaming down her face, her abandoned flower crown lying forgotten in the dust. Silas slid to the ground, his back against the rock. The pain was a living thing, a fire devouring him from the inside out. He could feel the venom, a poison tide, beginning its journey through his veins. He looked at the dead snake, then at the sky, a vast, indifferent blue. He had lived a hard life. If this was its end, so be it. He had done what was right. He was there when he was needed. He was already losing the feeling in his foot when he heard the thunder of hooves. John Vance galloped up, rifle in hand, his face a mask of fear. He leaped from his horse before it had even stopped. "Silas. My God." "The knife, John." Silas forced the words out. "And your belt. Quick." What followed was a brutal, bloody ordeal. Without hesitation, John Vance took Silas's skinning knife, sliced deeply across the bite marks in an X, and tried to draw out the poisoned blood. He cinched his belt tight around Silas's thigh as a tourniquet. They loaded him onto his horse, and the ride back to the ranch house was a delirious nightmare of jolting pain. That night, a visitor was at the Circle 5, a man whose presence always set Silas's teeth on edge. Bartholomew Corbin. Corbin was a land baron from the east, a man who bought up distressed properties with a predatory glee. He dressed in tailored suits that seemed to repel the Texas dust, and spoke with a voice as smooth and dangerous as oiled machinery. He was negotiating with John to buy a southern parcel of the ranch, one with a year-round spring. Corbin stood on the porch, a cigar in his hand, watching with detached amusement as they hauled the half-conscious Silas inside. "Good help is so hard to find," Corbin said, his lips curling into a smirk. "And even harder to keep, it seems. A shame to lose a man over a simple snake." John Vance shot him a look of pure loathing. "This man just saved my daughter's life, Corbin. Show some respect." Corbin simply shrugged, taking a puff from his cigar. "A noble gesture. Let's hope it wasn't a fatal one. Now about that spring." For 3 days, Silas hovered on the brink of death. The fever raged, his leg swelled to twice its size, turning a horrific shade of black and purple. Ellie never left his side. She sat on a small stool by his cot, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, her small face etched with a maturity far beyond her years. She whispered to him in his delirium, telling him stories, promising him he'd get better. She felt a profound and unshakable sense of debt, a feeling that settled deep in her soul. He had taken the venom that was meant for her. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. Silas woke weak and drenched in sweat to see Ellie asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot. He was alive. A week later, still limping heavily, he was back outside. John Vance tried to give him a bonus, a handsome sum of money. Silas refused. "I didn't do it for money, John." "I know," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion, "which is why you deserve it. Silas, I am in your debt." "No debt between us," Silas said simply. But little Ellie saw it differently. The day before he returned to his duties, she came to him as he sat on the porch steps carving a piece of wood. She stood before him, her hands clasped behind her back. "See," she said, her voice small but firm. "Ellie," she took a deep breath, "I want to make you a promise." He stopped carving and looked at her. "You saved me," she said, her blue eyes locked on his. "If you are ever in trouble, I don't care where I am or what I'm doing, I will come back. I will find you, and I will help you. I promise." A rare, gentle smile touched Silas Kane's lips. He looked at this tiny, fierce girl and felt a warmth spread through his chest. It was a child's promise, born of trauma and gratitude. Sweet, but as fleeting as the wildflower crown she'd been making. In the harsh reality of the West, promises like that were broken by time, by distance, by life. "I appreciate that, Ellie," he said softly. "I surely do." He didn't know, then couldn't possibly know that her promise was forged, not in the dust of a child's fancy, but in the unyielding steel of her character. He didn't know that 15 years later, that promise would be the only thing standing between him and a hangman's rope. 15 years is a lifetime in the West. It's enough time for greenhorns to become old-timers, for boom towns to become ghost towns, and for good men to be buried and their legacies forgotten. For Silas Kane, those 15 years had etched themselves onto his face and into his bones. The limp from the rattlesnake bite was a permanent, aching reminder of that day, more pronounced in the cold of winter. He was still at the Circle 5, but the ranch was a hollowed-out shell of its former self. John Vance was dead. The official story was a riding accident 5 years back. His horse, spooked by a rock slide in Blackwood Canyon, had thrown him. A tragic, simple end. But Silas never believed it. John knew that Canyon like the back of his hand, and his stallion was the steadiest mount in the county. But Silas was just a ranch hand, and his suspicions were dismissed as the grief-addled ramblings of a loyal employee. The real vulture, Bartholomew Corbin, had finally gotten his prize. With John gone and his wife having passed years before the ranch's deed had fallen into a complicated trust for Ellie, who had been sent back east for a formal education long before her father's death. Corbin, with his army of lawyers and his bottomless well of money, had exploited every loophole. He'd challenged the trust, bought up the water rights, and foreclosed on neighboring properties, effectively strangling the Circle 5. All that was left was the original homestead and a few hundred acres of the driest pasture land, managed by a distant, overwhelmed cousin of the Vances, who was no match for Corbin's machinations. Corbin now owned nearly the entire valley. His own brand, the Black Sea, was on thousands of head of cattle. His main ranch house was an opulent 2-story mansion that looked jarringly out of place against the rugged landscape. And the town of Redemption Creek, once a sleepy but independent settlement, was now effectively Corbin's private fiefdom. He owned the bank, the general store, and the saloon. And he owned the sheriff. Sheriff Brody was a man whose spine was as flexible as his morals. He was a large, sweating man with a handlebar mustache that couldn't hide the weakness in his chin. He'd won his election with a flood of Corbin's money, and his primary duty wasn't to uphold the law, but to enforce Corbin's will. Silas was a thorn in Corbin's side. He was a living link to the Vance legacy, a silent, walking accusation. He saw the way Corbin's men cut fences, the way his cattle strayed onto Circle 5 land to graze the way fear had poisoned the entire valley. More than that, Corbin knew that Silas suspected the truth about John Vance's death. As long as Silas remained, the ghost of John, Vance would never truly be at rest. Corbin needed him gone. The frame-up when it came was as cruel as it was brilliant. Corbin's foreman was a brutish man named Jedediah Riggs. Riggs was a bully who enjoyed his power, and he and Silas had a history of bad blood. Riggs took particular pleasure in goading the aging ranch hand, often making veiled insults about his loyalty to a dead and buried family. One evening in the Redemption Creek saloon, Riggs pushed it too far. "Still playing nursemaid to a patch of dirt, old man." Riggs sneered, his breath sour with whiskey. "Vance is gone. The girl's probably married some rich dandy in Boston. They ain't coming back for you. You're just a relic." Silas, nursing a single beer, didn't rise to the bait. "Leave it be, Riggs. Or what, you gonna bore me to death with stories of the good old days?" Riggs shoved Silas's shoulder. "Corbin owns this valley. He owns you. You just don't know it yet." Silas stood up slowly, his bad leg throbbing. He looked Riggs dead in the eye, his voice low and cold. "A man who has to say he owns things usually ain't got a firm hold on 'em. Now back off." The saloon went quiet. Riggs, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, balled his fists. But something in Silas's unblinking gaze made him hesitate. He spat on the floor near Silas's boots. "Your time is coming, old man." He then stormed out of the saloon. 2 days later, Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies rode out to the Circle 5 homestead. Silas was in the barn, re-shoeing one of the last few horses. "Silas Kane," Brody said, his voice trying for official gravity, but only achieving a self-important boom. "I'm placing you under arrest." Silas slowly lowered the horse's hoof and straightened up. "On what charge, Sheriff?" "Murder," Brody said, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "The murder of Jedediah Riggs." Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was happening. Riggs. What happened to him? He was found this morning out by Blackwood Canyon, shot in the back, a .45 caliber slug according to the doc. Brody explained a little too eagerly. "Funny thing is, we found this not 20 yards from the body." One of the deputies held up a large, distinctive skinning knife. It was the one Silas had carried for 20 years, the one John Vance had used to cut the venom from his leg. Its handle was a unique piece of polished mesquite wood he'd carved himself. "That's my knife," Silas said, his voice flat. "Lost it a few days ago. Figured it fell off my saddle." "Or you dropped it after you ambushed him," Brody countered. "We have witnesses that saw you threaten Riggs in the saloon. You had motive, you had opportunity, and we have the weapon. Or near enough." It was a perfect, neatly tied package, a public argument, a lost knife found at the scene. The location, Blackwood Canyon, was a poetic, cruel twist, the same place John Vance had supposedly met his end. Corbin wasn't just framing him, he was mocking him. "This is a setup, Brody, and you know it," Silas said, his gaze hard. "All I know is I have a dead body and a mountain of evidence pointing right at you," Brody blustered, gesturing with his pistol. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Silas knew it was pointless to resist. They would gun him down right here and call it resisting arrest. He did as he was told, the cold steel of the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. As they led him out of the barn, he saw the Vance cousin wringing his hands on the porch, his face a picture of helpless fear. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The ride to the Redemption Creek jail was a somber one. The news spread like wildfire. Silas Kane, the quiet, steadfast man of the circle. 5. A killer. It didn't sit right with some of the older folks, but Corbin's influence had been absolute for years. Whispers were quickly silenced. Doubts were swallowed. To stand with Silas was to stand against Corbin, and no one was brave enough or foolish enough to do that. The cell was small, damp, and smelled of stale sweat and despair. Through the single-barred window, Silas could see the raw timber of a new structure being built on the edge of town. A gallows. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of bad food, worse coffee, and Brody's smug visits. The circuit judge, a man known to enjoy Corbin's fine brandy and political donations, was due in town in a week. The trial would be a formality. A conviction was a foregone conclusion. One evening as the sun set, casting long orange shadows through the bars, Silas sat on his cot, his head in his hands. He thought of John Vance. He thought of the ranch as it once was, and he thought of a little girl with corn silk hair and a fierce, impossible promise. It had been a sweet thought all those years ago. Now it was just another ghost to haunt him in this cold, dark cell. He was an old man, framed for a crime he didn't commit, destined to hang for the entertainment of a town too scared to speak the truth. He had been there when he was needed, but now, in his darkest hour, there was no one left to be there for him. The West was good at swallowing men like him, and his time, it seemed, was finally up. The news traveled the way it did in 1893, by telegraph wire and by train passed from station masters to conductors to passengers. A short clinical report in the Arizona Sentinel about an impending murder trial in the small Texas town of Redemption Creek was all it took. The article mentioned the accused, a ranch hand named Silas Kane, and the victim a foreman for the powerful land baron Bartholomew Corbin. That newspaper eventually found its way to a federal office in Prescott, Arizona, where it was laid on the desk of a U.S. marshal who had earned a reputation for being methodical, relentless, and utterly incorruptible. Marshal Elara Vance was no longer the wisp of a girl Silas Kane remembered. The 15 years that had weathered him had sharpened her. The education back east had given her a mind as keen as a razor, but it was the training at the Marshal's Academy and the years spent hunting fugitives in the harsh territories that had forged her spirit into tempered steel. Her corn silk hair was now usually tied back in a severe but practical bun, and her twilight blue eyes, once wide with childhood innocence, now missed nothing. They were the eyes of a hunter, an investigator, a woman who had seen the worst of men and had chosen time and again to stand against it. She wore a simple tailored duster over a practical skirt and blouse, but it was the badge pinned over her heart and the holstered Colt peacemaker on her hip that defined her. She had chosen a life of law because she had seen firsthand what happened in its absence. She had seen how power left unchecked could fester and consume. The memory of Bartholomew Corbin's smug, dismissive face on the day Silas was bitten was burned into her memory. The accident that had killed her father had solidified a cold, hard resolve in her heart. She had long suspected foul play, but from afar, with the trust being mismanaged and her own life taking a different path, she'd had no means to act. Until now. Silas Kane. Reading his name in the crime report was like a physical blow. It cut through the years and the distance, bringing her right back to that dusty creek bed, to the terror and the pain, and to the solemn promise she had made. If you are ever in trouble, I will come back. She folded the newspaper, her movements precise and deliberate. Her superior Chief Marshal Clayton, a grizzled veteran with a healthy respect for her abilities, looked up as she entered his office. "I need a leave of absence, sir," she said, her voice even, "and authorization to operate across state lines. A personal matter has become a federal one." "How so, Vance?" "The accused in this case is a man to whom I owe my life. The man who owns the town where he's to be tried. Bartholomew Corbin has systematically dismantled my family's estate under suspicious circumstances, including the death of my father, a U.S. citizen. The local law enforcement is by all accounts in his pocket. I believe this constitutes a conspiracy to deprive a man of his rights and life under color of law. I suspect interstate commerce violations related to Corbin's cattle operations as well. It's thin, but it's enough to get my foot in the door." Clayton stroked his chin, studying her. He knew of her family history. He also knew that when Marshal Vance had a hunch, it was usually grounded in something solid. You're not going in as a gunslinger, Vance. You're going in as an officer of the court. Observe, investigate, ensure the federal laws are respected. Do not start a war. "My intention is to stop one, sir," she replied. "Or, failing that, to end it." The journey to Redemption Creek was a journey into her own past. With every mile the train covered the lush greens of Arizona, gave way to the familiar harsh beauty of West Texas. When she finally disembarked, the town was just as she remembered it, only sadder, more subdued. The life had been squeezed out of it. The storefronts bore fresh paint, but the faces of the people were worn and fearful. The name Corbin was on the bank, the general store, the hotel. It was a town under occupation. She didn't go to the hotel. Instead, she went straight to the sheriff's office, her duster sweeping behind her. She entered without knocking. Sheriff Brody was sitting with his boots up on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. He looked up annoyed, his eyes widening slightly as they took in the woman standing before him. "Ma'am, this is he started. She cut him off, her voice as crisp as a breaking twig. "I am United States Marshal Elara Vance." She pulled back her duster to reveal the silver star. "I'm here to observe the trial of Silas Kane. I'll need to see the prisoner. Now." Brody's jaw went slack. He stumbled to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. A U.S. Marshal, a Lady Marshal." He looked from her face to the badge, to the gun on her hip, his mind struggling to process the reality of it. "Now hold on. This is a local matter. We don't need no federal interference. Murder is always a federal matter when I have reason to believe a conspiracy is at play to deprive a man of his life without due process. Sheriff," she said, her blue eyes as cold as ice chips. "And I have reason. The prisoner, Sheriff. Take me to him." There was no arguing with the authority in her voice or with the star on her chest. Grumbling Brody grabbed a ring of keys and led her down the short hallway to the cells. The smell hit her first damp stone and despair. And then she saw him. Silas was sitting on the edge of the cot, His shoulders slumped. He looked older than she could have imagined, the years having carved deep ravines into his face. He looked up as the cell door creaked open, his eyes weary, expecting another round of torment from Brody. His gaze fell on Elara. His brow furrowed in confusion. He saw a tall, confident woman in a duster, the glint of a badge. And then his eyes met hers, the deep twilight blue. Recognition dawned, slow and disbelieving. "Ellie," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. The sound of her childhood name in his familiar gravelly voice almost broke her composure, but she held it for his sake. "It's Marshal Vance now, Si," she said, her own voice softer than it had been with Brody. She stepped into the cell as the sheriff watched, glowering from the doorway. I don't understand," Silas stammered, slowly getting to his feet. "I made you a promise a long time ago," she said simply. "I told you if you were ever in trouble I would come back. It seems you're in trouble." Tears welled in the old man's eyes, tears of shock, of disbelief, of a hope he had long since extinguished. "Ellie, my godchild!" She gave a curt nod toward Brody. "We don't have long. I need you to tell me everything. Start with my father's death." The reunion was not one of tearful embraces. It was a council of war in a cold jail cell. Silas, his voice finding its strength, recounted everything, his suspicions about the accident, Corbin's relentless absorption of the ranch, the public argument with Riggs, the perfectly planted evidence. Elara listened, her face impassive, but her mind was a whirlwind of activity, piecing together the timeline, identifying the weak points, formulating a strategy. "They mean to hang you, Si," she said when he was finished. "The judge is in Corbin's pocket. The trial is just for show." "I know," Silas said, his brief flicker of hope dimming. "What can you do? You're one person." "I am one U.S. Marshal," she corrected him firmly. "And that gives me power they don't understand yet. They think the law is a tool for men like Corbin to use. I'm here to remind them that it's also a shield for men like you. And sometimes," she added, her hand dropping instinctively to the butt of her Colt, "it's a sword." She turned to leave. "Sit tight. Don't say a word to anyone. Your trial may be in a few days, but mine begins right now." As she walked back out into the sun-drenched street, leaving a stunned Sheriff Brody and a reborn Silas Kane. In her wake, Elara Vance knew the odds were stacked against her. Corbin owned the town, the law, and the fear of the people. But he didn't own her, and he didn't own the truth. She was the ghost of Redemption Creek, a specter from a past he thought he had successfully buried. And she was here to dig up the bones. Elara knew that a direct assault on Corbin would be futile. He was too insulated, too powerful. She couldn't fight him with bullets, not yet. She had to fight him with facts. She had to dismantle his perfect frame-up piece by piece until it collapsed under its own weight. Her first stop was the office of Dr. Alistair Finch, the town's physician. Finch was an old man now, with trembling hands and the smell of whiskey perpetually on his breath. He had been the one to pronounce John Vance dead 5 years ago, and the one who had examined Jedediah Riggs's body. She found him in his dusty office, a bottle close at hand. "Marshal Vance," she introduced herself, forgoing any pretense of familiarity. "I'm reviewing the case against Silas Kane. I need to see your report on the death of Jedediah Riggs." Finch paled, his hand shaking as he poured himself a drink. "Sheriff Brody has the only copy." "Then you'll have to write me a new one from your notes," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And while you're at it, I'd like a copy of your report on the death of my father, John Vance." The mention of her father made the doctor flinch, as if struck. That was years ago. A simple accident." "Humor me," Elara said, her voice dangerously soft. "Let's start with Riggs. You determined he was killed by a .45 caliber slug. How did you determine the caliber without extracting the bullet?" Finch stammered. The entry wound. It was characteristic of a .45. "Was it? Or were you told it was a .45 by Sheriff Brody, who just so happened to know that Silas Kane carries a .45? The doctor looked away, refusing to meet her eyes. Elara pressed on. "And my father. Blackwood Canyon is known for its loose shale. A fall from a horse there would cause significant blunt force trauma, likely multiple fractures. Your report mentions only a single clean break at the base of the skull, an injury more consistent with, say, being struck from behind with a heavy, blunt object, like the butt of a rifle." Finch slammed his glass down. "Get out." He croaked, his face a mess of sweat and fear. "I won't be threatened by you." "I'm not threatening you, Doctor," Elara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm offering you a choice. You can be a witness for the federal government in a conspiracy case, or you can be a defendant. Your cooperation will be noted. So will your refusal." She left him trembling, the seed of fear she'd planted beginning to sprout. He was a weak link. Next, she needed to find an ally, someone who hadn't been bought or broken by Corbin. She remembered an old ranch hand from her father's time, a gnarled old-timer named Gus, who had been Silas's closest friend. Corbin had fired him years ago, and he now eked out a living doing odd jobs on the edge of town. She found him mending a harness behind the livery stable. He was wary at first, his eyes darting around nervously. "Marshal Vance," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Heard you was in town. You're stirring up a hornet's nest." "The hornets were already stirred, Gus. They just thought the nest was theirs," she replied. "I need your help. You knew Silas and Riggs. Silas is not a man to shoot someone in the back." Gus shook his head. "No, ma'am. She would face a man. Even a snake like Riggs." He paused, then lowered his voice. "The night Riggs was killed, something ain't right. Riggs was bragging in the saloon. Not just about Silas. He was drunk, saying he knew secrets that made him valuable to Mr. Corbin. Said he was due for a big bonus." Elara's mind raced. A disgruntled foreman who knew too much and was demanding more money. That was a powerful motive for murder for Corbin. "Did anyone else hear this?" "A few, but they got families. They won't talk." Gus looked her in the eye. Riggs wasn't killed by Silas. He was silenced by Corbin. "I know it, Gus, but I need to prove it." She then asked about the murder weapon. "Silas's knife. He said he lost it a few days before the murder." Gus nodded. "He did. He was out checking the northern fence line, the one that borders Corbin's property. He came back cussing about it. Said the sheath must have come loose." "The northern fence line, near Corbin's property. It was too convenient. Someone from Corbin's ranch could easily have picked it up." Her investigation was creating ripples. That evening, as she walked back to the livery, where she'd stabled her horse, Sheriff Brody, and 2 of Corbin's hired guns blocked her path. "That's enough poking around, Marshal," Brody warned, his hand resting on his gun. "You're starting to upset the peace." "The only thing I'm upsetting is a lie, Sheriff," Elara said calmly. Her body angled so she could see all 3 men. Her duster was open, her hand hovering near her Colt. "Mr. Corbin wants you to know that federal authority has its limits," one of the thugs growled. "This is his town. This is a town in the state of Texas, in the United States of America," she retorted, her voice ringing with authority. and it is subject to its laws. Now, unless you are placing me under arrest for a crime, I suggest you get out of my way." The men hesitated, caught off guard by her utter lack of fear. They were used to intimidating ranchers and shopkeepers, not a federal marshal who looked ready and willing to draw down on all three of them. After a tense standoff, Brody grumbled, and they moved aside, letting her pass. She knew it was a temporary victory. They were testing her. The next time they wouldn't start with words. The key, she realized, was the murder itself. There had to be a flaw in the story. Gus's information was crucial. Riggs was killed because he knew something. What did he know? The most valuable secret in the valley was the truth about John Vance's death. Riggs had been with Corbin for years. He might have been involved. She decided on a bold move. She rode out to Blackwood Canyon to the spot where Riggs's body was found. It was a desolate, eerie place, the site of 2 murders disguised as something else. She dismounted and surveyed the scene. Brody's men had trampled all over it, but Alara wasn't looking for footprints. She was looking for vantage points. Her eyes scanned the rocky cliffs that overlooked the canyon floor. A perfect spot for an ambush. But who would be up there? No one, unless they had a reason to hide. Her gaze fell on a small, almost hidden path leading up into the rocks. On a hunch, she began to climb. Near the top, tucked away behind a cluster of boulders, she found it. A small sheltered overhang, and signs of a recent campfire. A discarded tin of beans, a half-smoked cigarillo, and an empty bottle of cheap whiskey. This was a hideout. She scanned the ground and saw a glint of metal. She knelt and picked it up. It was a brass casing from a spent rifle cartridge. She examined the firing pin impression. It was from a rifle, not a .45 pistol. And then she heard a sound, a cough. She drew her Colt in a single, fluid motion. "Come on out," she called, her voice steady. Slowly. From behind a large rock, a figure emerged, hands raised. It was an old prospector she had seen in town, a man named Henderson, his face a road map of wrinkles and his clothes little more than rags. "Don't shoot, Marshal," he pleaded, his eyes wide with fear. "I ain't done nothin'. You were up here the night Jedediah Riggs was killed," she stated, not asked. Henderson nodded miserably. "I seed it. I seed the whole thing." "Tell me," she commanded. "I was here minding my own business," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw Riggs ride into the canyon below. He was waiting for someone. Then 2 other men rode up. One of them was Sheriff Brody." Alara's grip on her pistol tightened. "They was arguing," Henderson continued. "Riggs was yelling about getting what was promised to him. He said he did the job on Vance and kept his mouth shut for 5 years, and now he wanted his due. Brody told him to shut his mouth. Then the other man, he just pulled his rifle and shot Riggs in the back. Riggs just fell from his horse." "Who was the other man?" Alara asked, her heart pounding. Henderson was shaking his head, too terrified to speak. "Who was the shooter?" she demanded, her voice like cracking ice. The old prospector finally looked at her, his eyes full of the horror he'd witnessed. "It was Corbin," he whispered. "Bartholomew Corbin himself." Alara finally had it. An eyewitness. The truth raw and undeniable. Riggs hadn't been killed by Silas. He'd been executed by his own boss for threatening to expose the murder of John Vance. The frame-up of Silas was just Corbin's way of cleaning house, a piece of monstrously efficient housekeeping. "You, sir, are now a material witness in a federal investigation," she told Henderson, holstering her pistol. "You're coming with me. You'll be kept safe." As she led the terrified prospector down the cliff path, Elara knew the investigation was over. The battle was about to begin. She had the truth, a sharp and deadly viper, and she was about to release it in the heart of Corbin's corrupt empire. The storm broke at dawn. Elara didn't wait for the trial. She rowed back into Redemption Creek with Henderson in tow and went straight to the telegraph office. She sent a detailed wire to Chief Marshal Clayton in Prescott, outlining the conspiracy, the confession of Dr. Finch, whom she'd visited again and successfully broken, and the eyewitness testimony to 2 murders committed by Bartholomew Corbin. She requested immediate backup and federal warrants for the arrest of Corbin and Sheriff Brody. She knew, however, that the telegraph wire could be cut, and help was a day's ride away at best. Corbin would not wait to be cornered. He would act, and he would act decisively. She deputized Gus on the spot, handing the stunned but resolute old-timer a spare pistol and a box of cartridges. "I need one man I can trust, Gus. I'm taking Henderson to the jail. It's the most fortified building in town. We're going to hold up there and protect Silas." "He'll come for all of you, Marshal," Gus said, his knuckles white as he gripped the pistol. "He won't let that old prospector live to testify." "I'm counting on it," Elara said grimly. The jailhouse became a makeshift fortress. Elara barricaded the door with the sheriff's heavy desk. She checked her Colt Silas's old peacemaker that had been kept as evidence, and the pistol she'd given Gus. 3 guns against whatever army Corbin could muster. From his cell, Silas watched Elara work his heart, a painful mix of pride and terror. This brave, formidable woman was the same little girl who had woven flower crowns by the creek. "Ellie," he said, his voice hoarse, "you should have just run. Taken the witness and run." She paused, turning to face him through the bars. "And let them hang you. Let Corbin get away with killing my father. There are some things you can't run from and see. You taught me that. You said heroism was about being there when you're needed. I'm needed here." The silence of midday descended on the town, heavy and pregnant with violence. Shops were shuttered. Doors were bolted. The streets were unnervingly empty. It was the calm before the thunder. It came just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bloody hues of orange and red. The sound of a dozen horses riding into town. Corbin didn't send his thugs alone. He rode at their head alongside Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of cold fury. They were no longer pretending to be lawmen. They were a lynch mob. "Marshal Vance," Corbin's voice boomed through the street. "You are harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. Send out the prospector and surrender yourself." Elara went to the window, peering through the bars. "The man with me is a federal witness, Corbin. You and Sheriff Brody are the fugitives. I have warrants coming for your arrest for the murders of Jedediah Riggs and John Vance." Her accusation, shouted for all the hidden townspeople to hear, was a spark in a powder keg. A low murmur rippled through the silence. Corbin's face twisted in rage. The pretense was over. "There will be no warrants," he snarled, "and no witnesses. Burn it down." The first volley of shots shattered the jailhouse windows. Wood splintered from the door. Elara, Gus, and Silas, whom Elara had released from his cell, hit the floor. "Stay low. Don't waste your shots," Elara commanded the authority, in her voice cutting through the chaos. What followed was a desperate, brutal siege. Corbin's men, emboldened by numbers, charged the building. Elara's Colt barked a precise and deadly counterpoint to the wild firing of the attackers. A man trying to place a stick of dynamite at the door fell back, clutching his shoulder. Gus, positioned at a side window, fired with the steady resolve of an old soldier. Silas, his hands clumsy after years without a weapon, felt the familiar weight of the peacemaker. He moved to a window, his bad leg screaming in protest. He wasn't the man he once was, but the instincts were still there. He saw a gunman taking aim at Elara's position, and fired. The gunman cried out and dropped his rifle, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The heavy oak door began to splinter and crack under the assault. The air was thick with gun smoke and the smell of fear. "They're coming through the back," Gus yelled. Corbin, growing impatient, had sent half his men to smash through the weaker rear entrance. Elara knew they couldn't defend both directions. They were trapped. Then a new sound entered the fray. A single powerful rifle shot from a rooftop across the street. One of Corbin's men, about to throw a torch onto the jailhouse roof, cried out and toppled into the street. Another shot. A second man fell. Elara risked a glance. On the roof of the general store, Dr. Finch, the town's drunken, cowardly physician, was kneeling with a hunting rifle, his hands surprisingly steady. Her words, her appeal to his long-buried conscience, had found their mark. He had made his choice. His intervention bought them precious seconds. But it wasn't enough. With a final shattering crash, the main door of the jail gave way. Corbin's men poured in, guns blazing. The fight devolved into a close-quarters brawl of flashing muzzles and desperate cries. Gus went down, a bullet grazing his arm. In the chaos, Bartholomew Corbin himself stepped through the shattered doorway. A shotgun in his hands, his eyes locked on Elara. "It's over, Marshal!" he bellowed, leveling the weapon. Elara fired, but her shot went wide as a thug slammed into her. She was knocked to the ground, her pistol skittering across the floor. Corbin smiled a predator's grin and took aim. This was it. The moment stretched into an eternity. Silas saw it all. He saw Corbin aiming at the girl, the woman he had sworn to protect. He saw the life he had saved, about to be extinguished. The debt, the promise. With a roar that came from the depths of his soul, Silas threw himself forward. He didn't fire his gun. He didn't have a clear shot. Instead, he charged, his bad leg forgotten, and slammed his body into Corbin's side, just as the land baron pulled the triggers. The shotgun blast erupted with a deafening roar, tearing a huge hole in the ceiling where Elara's head had been moments before. The force of Silas's tackle sent both men crashing to the floor. The shotgun flew from Corbin's grasp. Elara scrambled, grabbing her fallen colt. She got to her feet as Silas and Corbin wrestled on the floor, a desperate tangle of limbs. Corbin was stronger, his face purple with rage, his hands closing around Silas's throat. "Silas!" Elara cried. Silas, his breath being squeezed from him, looked up at her. He couldn't speak, but his eyes conveyed the message. "Finish it." Elara raised her pistol, her hands steady, her aim true. She didn't shoot Corbin. That wasn't justice. That was an execution. Instead, she fired 2 shots with the speed of Canyon Jack from the dime novels into the floorboards on either side of Corbin's head. The splintering wood and the deafening concussion inches from his ears shocked him, making him flinch and loosen his grip for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He heaved, rolling Corbin off him. Elara stepped forward, pressing the hot muzzle of her Colt Peacemaker firmly against Bartholomew Corbin's forehead. The fight was over. The remaining thugs, seeing their leader defeated and hearing the distant but approaching sound of riders, the federal marshals threw down their guns. Later, as the dust settled, Elara stood outside the battered jailhouse. Sheriff Brody was in cuffs. Corbin, his face bruised and his arrogance shattered, was being loaded onto a prison wagon. Dr. Finch was being hailed as a hero, and Gus was having his arm bandaged. The town of Redemption Creek was free. Silas limped over to her, the old peacemaker hanging loosely in his hand. The setting sun cast their long shadows across the street. "Looks like I returned the favor," he said, his voice raspy. "Took the blast meant for you." Elara looked at him, her twilight blue eyes full of an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "You did more than that, see. You always have." She took a deep breath. "The debt is paid." He managed a small smile. "Never was a debt between us, Ellie. Just friendship." She knew he was right. It was something deeper than a debt. It was a bond forged in a moment of terror and sacrifice that had spanned 15 years and 1,000 miles. She was a U.S. marshal, and her path would lead her away from this town. He was a ranch hand, and his place was here on the land he had protected for so long. The Circle 5, which would now finally be rightfully hers and his, to rebuild. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Silas Kane." "Thank you, Marshal Vance," he replied. Their paths would diverge again, but they both knew the truth. In the heart of the wild and unforgiving West, the most powerful force wasn't greed or fear or violence. It was the simple, unshakable power of a promise kept. And so the quiet ranch hand and the marshal with the ghost of a little girl in her eyes saved each other, and in doing so they saved an entire town. Their story reminds us that the seeds of our future are often planted in the actions of our past, and that a single act of courage can echo through a lifetime. True justice isn't always found in the thunder of a 6-gun, but in the quiet strength of a promise kept. The West was a hard land, but it was people like Silas Kane and Elara Vance who proved that decency, loyalty, and courage could, in the end, tame even the most savage of frontiers. If this story of grit, justice, and redemption resonated with you, please help our channel grow by hitting that like button. Share this tale with someone else who loves a classic Western, and most importantly, subscribe for more stories from the annals of history and the heart of the wild frontier. Thanks for listening.